Now it's time to discuss what everybody's been waiting for, which is like, why is everybody so mad at France? They didn't do anything wrong. Like, France is the best. No, no, but in all seriousness, obviously something very, there was a huge development in just the last couple of days with yet another military coup, this time in the African country of Gabon. Um, and that has come along with a lot of French agitation. You see the French one of the French mining companies actually put a stop to their work at the moment because they're very concerned given the rise of anti-French, anti-colonial sentiment across many former French colonies in Africa. So let's start with Gabon. I mean, you and I did an episode, I think it was maybe 3 weeks ago, on the situation in Niger, and that has continued to escalate. So we'll be touching on that as well. But first, with the situation in Gabon, why are people opposed to the government in Gabon? And how is it similar to what we're seeing in other areas across West Africa? Is it as anti-French and even maybe anti-imperialist to say what we're seeing in like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger? Or is this more of a reaction to the government that has been in charge for a very, very long time in that country that also happens to be pro-West?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a great point there, Rania. I mean, I think, from what we've seen so far, it may be more of the latter. I mean, it may be more directly about the Bongo family, which ruled Gabon, for about 55 years, more or less, from independence on, in the country, and that had a reputation, of course, of absolutely being one of the closest countries to France and to the West in Africa and carrying out various things. For instance, they helped the United States and France build support for the intervention in Libya on the African continent. They were also one of the key drafters of the expansion of sanctions against Eritrea in 2011. So certainly they had that kind of reputation. They also, of course, had a reputation for taking a lot of the money out of the country and using it for their own self-aggrandizement. I mean, there was at least one investigation into the holdings of the Bongo family in France. They had something like maybe $100 million worth of property and other assets there in France, and that's just what the report could find out. And as that would, of course, suggest to you, it's obviously a country that produces quite a bit of wealth. The main export, as some people may have heard, is oil from Gabon. I think last year, it's a very relatively small country, so it's about $1 billion, I think, in oil revenues, which, compared to like Saudi Arabia is nothing. But for a, small country like this, it's very significant. They also sell carbon credits. They've started doing that over the past couple years. There was a major logging industry there, but they've now claimed, at least, that they are curtailing the logging industry, and they're setting up to try to sell about $2.2 billion worth of carbon credits over the next couple years. Although climate campaigners are saying that that's, based on a lot of dodgy statistics. But, nevertheless, it's a country that generates a fair amount of wealth, the relatively small population, about 2 million people. I think the per capita GDP is about $18,000 when you look at it at PPP terms. So on the surface, it's not only generating a lot of wealth, but apparently, and I think the image they've always tried to present to the world is that, people are living pretty well there. But that is the image they've presented, but not the reality. And I think that's why you saw people come out into the streets so quickly to welcome, this new military government there. I mean, you've got, in a country with a huge amount of oil wealth, as I just mentioned, about a third of the people who are living in poverty. Overall, you've got about 21% unemployment, but youth unemployment is more like 37%. So, almost 40% of young people without, jobs. So I think very similar to what we've seen in other countries in Africa that have had similar military transitions, I think you see people are ready to move on. They'd like to see a change. They don't think that the government of the Bongo family, the multiple governments, the father, Omar, the son, Ali, have been really delivering in terms of using the wealth to the, maximum needs of the people there. And this is something you also saw in 2016. Ali Bongo, who was deposed, ran in an election that I think was widely tipped as being fraudulent, or if not fraudulent, at least fully fraudulent, at least a little fraudulent. He was declared the winner nonetheless. There were big protests there in Gabon amongst the population. A number of people were killed. I believe about 1,000 people were arrested. And of course, once it was suppressed, the Western countries went on and recognized his government. But again, that's, even though it's a few years back, I think also speaks to seeing people come out onto the streets after this military transition, because this has been a long-held feeling, obviously, that people wanted to eject them and had trouble doing so vis-a-vis the elections, the electoral process, which I think they viewed as rigged. I think there were many complaints about that election in 2016 and this election. But vis-a-vis France, just to finish that point right there that you just mentioned, let's see what happens. I mean, I think a lot of what will happen vis-a-vis France probably will determine how they respond to this. And so far they've been against it. But, this morning, for instance, you saw the government of Gabon lift the ban on the French media. Now, it's an interesting thing. So after the election, the opposition was complaining that the election was stolen. And some of the French media was reporting that the opposition was saying this. So Ali Bongo, they shut down the French media, RFI, Jeune Afrique. They say you can't publish anymore. So it seems that perhaps the new military government is seeking to perhaps send a message to France that they're not as hostile. There's about 400 French troops in Gabon. They have not asked for them to leave. I think in the main demonstrations I've seen, or at least the pictures and the images I've been able to see, it seems people more happy that the Bongo family has been ejected, as opposed to some of the deeper messaging around the broader sort of France-Afrique, French neo-colonialism. But that being said, that's not to say people in Gabon don't have critiques of France. And I think how this develops will very much depend on how France itself responds. I mean, they have technically said that they are against this as of right now, but it does seem perhaps there's an attempt to maneuver. The general, who is the new head of this military junta, for lack of a better term, has a long history as working with the father, Bongo, for being very involved in the power politics of the country, for himself having quite a bit of wealth, or at least alleged to have quite a bit of wealth outside of the country. So what exactly the motivations are of these officers, I think, like we said in our last thing about several other countries, I think we might have to see a little bit how it develops. But I think bottom line, I think when you see the images of people who are out protesting, I think it's important to recognize that that is because, rather than some, displacement of democracy, the way that it's being portrayed in the Western media, like democracy falling to a military government, this has been basically a kleptocratic, family-run enterprise that's called a country, where the wealth is being siphoned off primarily to Europe by the leaders and by these foreign countries, and that the so-called democracy was not delivering what it claimed to, was rigged when it had to be, and that people are very happy to see a system like that, pass from the scene.
Very well said. And it will be interesting to see how the Europeans respond to, this other coup. They might try to frame it differently, like you said, if it ends up being not so antagonistic towards the French, towards the Europeans in general. Meanwhile, back when it comes to the issue of Niger, you had the European Union foreign ministers having met just a few hours ago in Spain and having decided to basically lay the legal groundwork for sanctions on the leaders in Niger who took over the country. But they still are, hesitant to say whether or not they will support military action. And just so people know, I mean, them laying the legal groundwork for sanctions, this is being done to what's considered the second poorest country in the world. And already the sanctions that have been imposed on Niger by ECOWAS have caused food shortages in a country that already faces food scarcity, because it is a landlocked country. So Niger is very vulnerable to sanctions by its neighbors like this. Meanwhile, you do have a country like Burkina Faso, which has come out and expressed solidarity and is even discussing, perhaps you can give me more details on this, sending in its own military to support Niger in the case of any sort of military intervention. So let me just stop there and give you the opportunity to update us on what's happening in Niger.
Well, I think that you spoke to some of the important points. Obviously, there's the issue of sanctions being leveled by the EU on top of the ECOWAS sanctions, which, the EU has been supporting and essentially, collaborating with them on enforcing them. The World Food Program and other aid organizations have already warned, famine could result from this. You've got 4.5, 5 million people in Niger who depend almost totally on humanitarian aid. And the World Food Program is saying that they're unable to get that aid in primarily because of the sanctions. You have the power has been cut from Nigeria to Niger, and Nigeria provides the vast amount of power. There are all sorts of reports of what the results of that are. I mean, of course, not having power, everyone can think of the general results, but we've even heard some reports coming from the Nigerian media, including actually also not just from the media, but supporters of the president of Nigeria even have been putting this out there, that babies are dying in incubators and hospitals because of a lack of electricity. So, we're hearing those kind of, very distressing reports coming from, multiple different angles as it concerns the impact of the sanctions. And here we are having the EU saying that they're going to level even more sanctions. Now, of course, they say, oh, we'll have a humanitarian, exception. But as we know that those exceptions really don't matter at all because people over comply with sanctions. And as soon as you put them on any high level official or government or entity, it has a huge impact. So I would say, that probably is the biggest news with what's happening right now in Niger. I think the second piece is, will there be an ECOWAS intervention? And I think it's important to note here that the sort of fait accompli, like it seemed like it was guaranteed to happen in the first couple of days, after the military transition started in Niger, has been slipping. And that, I think, is primarily because you've seen all around the region a huge amount of opposition to this. I mean, Nigeria, which was sort of the lead country, the Senate of Nigeria, of course, opposed it. Major religious institutions opposed it. People inside of the president's own party opposed it. And so the president of Nigeria, towards the end of last week, despite being one of the first out of the gate to say, we have to do this, is then now last week was saying, well, I'm the number one person holding them back from doing it. So don't know how that switched around, but it does show the impact, I think, of the outcry that has happened inside of Nigeria, all across West Africa. Countries like Algeria and others have, been saying they don't want to see an intervention. And so now we continue to be in this weird state of, can there be a diplomatic solution? And if not, will the intervention take place? As for the issue of a diplomatic solution, some news that's come out in the past day or so is Algeria which of course is opposed or said they were opposed to ECOWAS intervention. They've been meeting with many regional countries. They're proposing a 6-month transitional process as opposed to the maximum of 3-year process that was proposed by the transitional regime in Niger. But now there are some reports coming out of ECOWAS this morning. Let's see if this holds itself out to be true. But some reports coming out that they're now proposing a 9-month transition. So that's interesting that they're going a little further than Algeria. But I think, again, another sign that I think the ECOWAS countries are very concerned that not only will the impact of an intervention potentially be a massive humanitarian disaster for the whole region and the possibility for a huge upsurge in the various insurgencies across the Sahel, but that even in their own countries, they will not be able to gain support for this, which could speak to exactly the issue that they have said they are worried about here. And that is, of course, a so-called domino effect of other countries falling to similar military transitions and the possibility of that being very high, because the kindling that is really, setting these fires ablaze is the intense poverty that you already spoke to, Rania. You have 50% of the country in Niger lives on less than $2.15 a day. About 43% live on less than $2 a day. So you get a sense, the poisoning of the air and the water from the mines, the 42% of people 5 to 14, children who are involved in child labor. The fact that 83% of people live in rural areas, but only 9% of them have access to electricity. Certainly Niger is always somewhere near the bottom on most social indicators, certainly on the Human Development Index. But this is something that can really be replicated all across the Sahel, all across West Africa, and all across sub-Saharan Africa. And I think many of the leaders who have facilitated these sorts of regimes and governments that have promoted this kind of status quo are deeply fearful of the fact that they too could be ejected. We saw Paul Biya in Cameroon has actually reshuffled his military leadership after what happened in Gabon. So I think there's a certain level of fear, not just from the consequences of an intervention, but that actually could potentially be a catalyst for an overthrow in their own countries on the part of some of these ECOWAS regimes. And I'll note Benin is another country that was, very heavily out there saying they were in favor of the intervention in Niger. They're still saying that. President Patrice Talon been outspoken, but we've seen the trade union movement in Benin, others in Benin also speak out against this. So we're seeing, and I think this is the part we're not hearing a lot about, but really we're seeing quite a upsurge, if you will, of sentiment all across West Africa of people of many different political persuasions who do not want to see an intervention. So I think that's more or less where we are in Niger, is that every day further into this we get, it seems like the less likely an intervention can take place or that it will take place, but there's still very little in terms of what a diplomatic solution could look like. And I think that there is, as we can see, still a lot of momentum coming out of this event. And the final thing I'll just say about Niger is the ongoing issue of the French ambassador and the French troops. And the French ambassador has been asked to leave the country. He's refusing to leave the country. He's had his diplomatic immunity stripped from him. The police have been ordered to try to find him and eject him from the country. And there are some reports, although I could not really 100% confirm the dates of this or the reality of this, but some reports that have been coming out that they are going to, or that they've already asked Niger, or that they will be asking France, all French troops, of which there are about, I think, 1,500, to leave the country by September 3rd. And as you can see, the images in between us, Rania, these are of the mass protests that have been happening almost daily in the capital of Niamey and also in other large cities in Niger in support of the military transitional process and against France. One of the main groups that's organizing those events, not the only, but one of the main, M62, they had a press conference today. I saw it right before we went on air, so I couldn't see the whole press conference. But one of the things that they were calling for is a pretty much permanent sit-in, if you will, in front of the French military base to try to push for French troops to leave. So we'll see if the Niger government, continues to follow that up with an official rejection. But events moving relatively quickly, but still, I think a lack of clarity in terms of what could potentially be possible with a diplomatic solution, and if that fails, what will take place after that.
I wanted to ask a bit about the issue of aid, Eugene, because in the way that this issue has been covered, as we see a lot of these countries pushing back against the West and France and all of these like military coups and all of the sort of anti-colonial, anti-imperialist rhetoric that we're seeing. One thing I've seen a lot in media and then also coming from Western leaders is really playing up the issue of aid, right? And how much aid the West gives to this region, almost like a how dare they when we just give them so much because they're so impoverished. But then also even openly discussing weaponizing that aid and denying that aid to these impoverished countries that are, of course, impoverished by Western policy as a means to punish countries like Niger, like Mali, who are pushing back against basically Western imperialism if they don't comply. So I'm curious if you could maybe set the record straight here. What can you tell us about that Western aid that they keep dangling in front of these countries and then threatening to suspend and then actually suspending? Has it actually helped those countries? Which, by the way, we should also mention, many of these countries have really high debts also because of Western policy that, is also, bragging about all the aid they give.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I saw, some guy, I don't know who he was, but on French television, really turning up his nose at Russia and saying, oh, well, the Russians, they're providing he's quoted some small amount of aid. And he's like, and that's only a fraction of what France is providing in terms of aid to these countries. So, the perception that's created, I think, both in this crisis with people using it as a talking point, but I think also just in the broader sort of conversation about Africa, is you hear these big numbers that are decontextualized, that they're giving large amounts of aid, hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars in aid. And obviously, to individuals, that's large amounts of money. But when you really compare it to the scale and the need of what's happening, you can see that it's totally minuscule. It's absolutely cosmetic. And in many ways, it's just a cover for the reality of what they're doing, which is maintaining a system that is deeply exploitative that's keeping these countries poor. But to get to the exact issue, I think this is notable. So if you look at Niger, for instance, and you take all the aid they got in 2021, it all amounts to $71 per person. So all the aid in Niger and all of 2021, if you break it down per each of the individual 25 million people, it's $71 per year per person. So that's about $1.37 per week per person. And out of that $1.37 per week per person in aid to Niger in 2021, 7 cents were spent on education, 15 cents on health. So 7 cents a week per person on education, 15 cents a week per person on healthcare. The bulk of it is actually spent just on survival style aid, right? Like people who are going to starve if they don't. But you can see almost none of it is really going towards, really significant buttressing. And, when I saw that quote, which I have to say are those numbers I got from Adam Tooze, who wrote about it in his Financial Times column, I got interested in looking more into this because I said, wow, that's amazing. Just $1.37 a week per person in aid in 2021. So I said, well, what's been going on in some of these other years? And especially because we're hearing a lot about how France and other countries are stopping their development aid in the context of, what's happening there in Niger. Now, the French development aid in all of 2022 to Niger, all of 2022 was, and forgive me for looking at my notes, but I want to get this right. We know the French media is watching. $131.6 million to Niger for all of 2022. That's $5.26 per person. Germany, who's also paused their aid to Niger, has a 2-year aid package. That's what they paused. It was last negotiated in 2021. So 2 years, also $131.6 million. So since it's over 2 years, that's $2.63 per person per year. The European Union, which has also paused their aid, is pausing a 2022 to 2026 aid package. So that's 5 years. $2.5 billion over 5 years. That's $20 per person per year. So you add up Germany, France, and the EU, basically per year, you're getting barely $32-ish, essentially, maybe a little less than that, barely $30 worth of aid per person. And, it's a part of a bigger issue. The U.S., by the way, don't want to leave the U.S. out. Their aid for 2023 that they have also stopped was supposed to be $233 million for the whole year, which is $9.32 per person. And since the State Department has done such a great job of breaking that amount of money down into what they're spending it on, that would be $1 per person per year for health, $1 per person per year on economic development, and $4.38 per person for the year in education funding. So when you break it down like that, when you think about the actual number of people in the country, the depth of the need, you can see that this aid is basically just fake. And the OECD has actually already addressed this issue and found that there is a gap of about $272 billion per year in the funding that is needed to meet the UN Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, which of course all these countries say their aid is going to support the UN, the SDGs, by 2030. So you can see essentially that almost no money is really being spent on the people of Niger. Most of the money is being extracted and sent into Europe. And this is all just used as a smokescreen to hide the fact that these are deeply exploitative economic relationships.
Yeah, it's what a complete scam. And I love that you described it as a smokescreen, because at the same time, it's like, okay, you're getting all this wealth out. You're extracting all this wealth basically for free. And then you're throwing in pennies. And then when we talk about what the need is, these countries actually could fill their own need. It's just everything is being taken from them to support luxury in the global north. So it's not like the US or Europe actually needs to give them they should give them hundreds of billions of dollars in reparations. But in a just world, it wouldn't even be necessary to send any aid. If anything, the aid would be coming the other way around because Europe has nothing to offer. But sorry, I'm just reacting now. I really appreciate you breaking all that down because it's that should be put into charts just to show it as a visual, because what you just said is quite astounding. But this kind of also brings us back to this, what you call a social explosion. And I think, as you've said before, there's the potential for so many more social explosions across Africa, basically because of what you just described. But why is it that France seems to be sort of like the tip of the spear here in the response or the reaction of these social explosions that we see across Western Africa? I mean, obviously some of that is because of the colonial legacy, but it must be because of something that France continues to do today. I assume, I have a feeling. But what is it about France?
No, I think you were right about that. And I think it's that, when we look at, as I mentioned earlier in the show, I mean, obviously all of sub-Saharan Africa is suffering from very similar issues in terms of poverty, the unemployment, especially youth unemployment, all of the various challenges that are being faced, insurgencies. But, I think there's almost an inordinate amount of that suffering that is concentrated in these, sort of former French colonies, which are, some of them actually not all French colonies, but, can be seen in the CFA franc zone. About 50%, if you look at the Human Development Index, which is one way of measuring, how good or how bad a country is doing essentially in terms of poverty, development, and so on. If you look at the 10 countries at the bottom, half of them are in the CFA franc zone. So you can see that already, and many of them are Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, but you can see already that these countries have sort of an inordinate reality. And I think that when you look at the history, the contemporary reality of development, people see that that's not an accident, that France is actually maintaining structures that in and of themselves make it very difficult, even if you were a, popularly oriented government, to make significant changes. And that's why I mentioned the CFA franc zone. That's the number one issue in many ways, is that the currency is controlled, not by France, but to some degree by Europe in and of itself, because now, of course, France doesn't have its own currency. It also uses the euro. But since formal independence for these countries in the CFA franc zone, their currency has been more or less controlled by their former colonial overlord. And it has a lot of different elements to it, but I think there are a few that are very relevant here. I mean, the most important is that the CFA franc, and there's two of them, one in West Africa, one in Central Africa, is pegged to the euro. So it's basically the same price as the euro. And that has a huge impact on these countries because it makes it very difficult for them to develop, their own industries, for one, right? I mean, if you think about it like this, if you live in Europe, if you live in the United States, and when you travel to somewhere in the global South, like the way that your $50 in America can get you 2 or 3 times what it could in the US, when you're in these other countries. It's more or less the same thing as it concerns investment in general. And so many countries, not just developing countries, pretty much all countries, they try to manipulate their currency, so to speak. It's often called devaluation, in order to try to make their exports more competitive. So the way it helps you develop new industries, more industries, because, rather than your neighboring country or 3 countries away, you become more attractive to build a factory to develop, this industry or that industry. But when you have the CFA franc, these countries can't devalue their own currency to be more competitive. And so ultimately it means, why would you go to, say, Mali when you could go to Ghana? Why would you go to Central African Republic when you can go to DRC? When you can go somewhere that has the ability to actually make it more worth your money. So just right there, it stops these countries from being able to develop their own industries, and it makes it actually better to import things than to export things. The other thing that it does, since you have full convertibility of the CFA franc to euros, is encourages people to take the money out of the country. So if you are one of the handful of wealthy elites in the country, it's actually more valuable to take your money out of the country and convert it to euros, the better currency, than to invest inside of your own country. It's also the same for companies that are working there. Rather than reinvest, better to take it out. So then you have the issue of capital flight also being encouraged by the use of the CFA franc. And capital flight is a huge issue in Africa anyway, so it's an even bigger issue issue in the context of this. And there are, different elements of it as well, is that since you can't change the value of your currency in the sense that it's pegged to the euro. For companies in Europe, this means that these governments and these countries in the CFA franc zone are really safe investments, right? Because, you invest in, say, Ghana, and if you invest today and the cedi, that's the Ghanaian currency, is worth X, and then by the time you want to take your money out, it's worth Y, and that's less, you've lost money, essentially. But you know that if you invest in Mali, if you invest in Chad, if you invest in Burkina Faso, Cote d'Ivoire, that ultimately the price is going to be the same as the euro, and it makes it a very safe investment. And so for a number of different companies, Orange, the telecom company, many of the pharmaceutical companies in France, many other European countries, it's an important area. It's not necessarily their largest area of economic activity. France may not even be their number one, trading partner, but nonetheless, for many strategic sectors, especially pharmaceuticals, telecommunications, and a few others, and also mineral resources as well, it's this very just safe place to invest your money, to be able to extract it and make a lot of money, because since you can't devalue your currency, the easiest way for these countries to maintain competitive is to make sure wages are as low as possible, to hold wages as low as possible, to make it difficult for people to join trade unions, to use force to try to disperse people from organizing and developing their economy. And so I say all that just to say that when you look at why France is becoming, why the Francophone African countries seem to be, the tip of the spear, as you say, in terms of this revolt happening across Africa, isn't because neo-colonialism isn't operated by, America, by Britain. It isn't because people in other countries aren't upset with it. But I think there is a unique combination of both the sort of historical colonial factor and the current and contemporary structures maintained by France that have created an inordinate amount of suffering in the CFA franc zone countries that has created a bubbling up that's at the leading edge of a type of anger that I think we actually see all across the African continent. And that's why former British colonies like Nigeria, like Ghana, that's why former Portuguese colonies, why, other countries are also very much fearful that their populations could, of course, rise up in a similar way. But, I think certainly we're just seeing certain countries be the leading edge because of, this reality of what France is actually doing today and how that really is like rubbing salt in the wound of what they've done in the past to heavily underdevelop these nations, to make it basically crippling them from their ability to grow and develop.
Yeah, it's really incredible. I also wanted to ask you before we wrap up here, Eugene, and that is, I've seen some conversations about, this regime isn't truly this, or this regime isn't pure that, like this coup regime or that coup regime. I guess I kind of raise that to say I'm sort of like, making fun of a little bit of the debate on the Western left about this sort of things, but about that sort of thing. But like, if we're talking about these countries, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Gabon now, all of these countries that have had these coups and that seem to be pushing, in the case of at least the first ones I mentioned, really pushing hard against France. How would you rank them in terms of their, I don't know, let's talk about motivations, revolutionary potential taking place in the aftermath of these coups? I guess the word progressive isn't the right word, but like, how do you rank them in terms of who's the most serious? What I'm saying? Like, who's the hardcore, like most hardcore to least hardcore?
Well, in all rankings, I could end up looking bad on this one. But before, maybe I get to that aspect of it, I do want to provide some greater context to how I think we should view it too, because even if you look at Gabon, where again, as I said earlier in the show, I mean, it seems that perhaps the military transition is trying to curry the favor of France, perhaps, and is not trying to push negatively, but we'll see how long that stays. I think even when you see that, and I think Guinea in a way can be put in a similar situation, not exactly the same, but you've seen if you compare, say, Guinea to Mali and Burkina Faso, Guinea is the role of France more ambiguous there. The guy who's taken over, his wife is like a French cop. I mean, it's an interesting story. They've actually been doing some things, I think, standing with Mali, standing with Niger, but you see them not as aggressively going against France. I mean, so it's, a little more ambiguous. But I think even in the cases of, say, the Gabons or the Guineas, where, we'll see what happens, but perhaps the motivations are more about the power struggles in those countries than the negative state of affairs for their populations, I still think it all represents one big crisis for France, France, and one big crisis for the US-EU neo-colonial policy in Africa, because they did not want these things to happen. Even if it ends up being semi-favorable to them, even if they can work out a deal to keep things going the way they had been going before, this is a change in the style of governance and control that they want to have over Africa that they did not foresee coming and that they did not want to happen. So it shows that whatever the various outcomes, that at the end of the day, you're seeing the ability of Western hegemony to totally determine the state of affairs in Africa is collapsing. I mean, even I've seen many commentators speak about this, that they're like, if this happened 20 years ago, France would have intervened in 2 hours in half these countries and overturned the government. But we're seeing that they fear doing that. The Italian defense minister actually spoke to this. He said, well, we don't want to do too much too openly, because then people will see it as a colonial imposition, and then we'll be in an even worse situation. And so I think you can see the sort of collapse of hegemony, even if there are individuals and figures who really just want to renegotiate the terms of the subordination of their nation. That's not a renegotiation that the imperialist powers wanted to see happen. So I think it's important to keep that framing in mind. But I think when we look at the countries themselves, obviously there's different gradations. I think for obvious reasons, Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, because of his comments at the Russia-Africa Summit, comments that he's made, in front of youth in Burkina Faso. I think many people are looking to Burkina as maybe the leading edge of these military transitions, these civil military projects, because it seems that he is speaking very directly to the social time bomb that has exploded, that has led to all of these different pieces in terms of trying to implement policies that will address, the needs of the people who have been so left out. And so, for instance, they have set the goal for themselves, ambitious goal, we'll see if they meet it, of creating 1 million jobs in the next couple years, giving 100,000 solar-powered water pumps to rural areas so that they can have clean water. They're saying that by 2025, they're going to spend $250 million on maternal health care, that they're going to electrify 605 localities, and that they're going to spend about 150-ish, 144, but close to $150 million on fertilizer, agricultural machinery, and seeds for farmers. Obviously, most of the people there live in rural areas and do work in agriculture. They grow a lot of tomatoes in Burkina Faso, but they don't make ketchup. So they're developing 3 new tomato processing plants to try to move up the value chain there. They've picked 3 artisanal mining sites that they're now trying to mechanize. They're also meeting with, large numbers of artisanal miners to talk to them about how they can improve the working conditions. And, artisanal is like a terrible term. You hear it a lot in Africa. That's like artisanal mining is the people who are basically just like digging holes in the ground. It's very, very dangerous. It pollutes the ground. You use mercury and cyanide to find the gold. So they're engaging with these young people and trying to find a way to bring them into the economy. And the way they're paying for some of these new projects is also interesting. They're also trying to set up a gold refinery, by the way. A lot of gold in there that's coming out of there. But the way they're paying for it is interesting. I mean, one, they have changed the mining code to redirect a lot of mining royalties directly into these new development projects. But also, they've created something that has the acronym of APEC, APEC, which is basically like a form of crowdfunding for Burkinabe people in the country and outside the country. You can buy in for about $25, although you can spend a lot more. But the goal is to have these development projects be funded primarily by the resources of the country and by the resources of the population and the diaspora, so that the new development projects have a sustainability because they're really rooted in the Burkinabe realities. So I think, it's fair to say from my point of view that Burkina has the most advanced discourse, on this issue of, really addressing development. We'll have to see how it goes moving forward, but I think that's notable. I think Mali probably next. And it's interesting we brought up the issue of France and how much money they're spending because, Mali has just changed their mining code to increase basically local ownership of mining from 20% to 35% of most of the projects. And I want to get this number right. Their expectation is that it will create in upcoming years, basically like per year into the budget, it'll give them about $820 million more a year in their budget. So a fair amount of money. But the reason I say that vis-a-vis aid, because at the height of the French operations in Mali. So 2013 to 2017 was like a big year for French operations in Mali. Over those 5 years, they gave $490 million to Mali in aid. So that means just by increasing to a relatively low amount to 30 some odd percent the national share of mining projects, Mali will get almost as much money in 1 year as France gave them in 5 years. So it shows the difference between aid and really making a big, impact in terms of your mineral resources. The government of Mali is a longer story, but they have a deal essentially with the main trade unions of Mali around a range of different things they're supposed to be doing. On May Day of this year, the unions reported that some things are happening, some things are not. The implementation of it is uneven, but one of them, for instance, is to try to raise the wages of public sector workers and private sector workers. The IMF, by the way, this year is complaining that Mali is spending too much money paying people better salaries in the public sector, and they better stop. So there's been a 91% increase in public sector wages since 2019. In the private sector, there's not as much happening. The gold mining issue is part of this pact with the trade union, so obviously they're moving on that. They're not moving on some issues of land reform. There's some issues vis-a-vis education. So it's an uneven sort of piece, but the trade unions in Mali did support the most recent constitutional referendum, continue to support the transitional regime, and they continue to try to work in tandem to, put forward, things that are related to this, February 5th, 2021 agreement they made. So I think that speaks to something there as well. If, the 120,000 workers organized under Mali's main trade union federation feel that at least there's still an opportunity to work through this entity to improve their own lives. And I think it more or less goes, down from there. I mean, in Guinea, we've seen some renegotiations of some iron ore contracts, some more infrastructure coming in, but not that much. Gabon, we shall see. And Niger, it's so new. I think it's, difficult to say, what exactly is going to take place there. But again, another country where the Trade Union Federation is supporting them. And I think Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, you also have these groups like M62 standing on the ramparts, the National Coalition of civil society organizations in Burkina Faso, which really represent, a lot of the poor people who are angry, who are supporting these governments. So I think we're seeing, at least in Niger, Mali, and Burkina, a real kind of civil military experiment. I think in Guinea, less so. I think in Gabon, we shall see. But I think that does speak to some degree, I think to the point you were raising, Rania.